Snow didn't just fall in the Bitterroots, it hunted. Caleb Boyd knew winter was coming early, and he knew he couldn't survive another season trapped in the silence of his own mind. He needed a partner with calloused hands, a broad back, and an iron spine. Instead, the stagecoach spit out Josephine Carmichael. She was draped in heavy eastern velvet, dragging leather trunks heavier than a felled pine. She looked like a stiff breeze would snap her in half. Caleb gave her 3 days before she'd beg for a ticket back to civilization. Dust hung thick in the air of Bitter Creek, tasting of dried horse manure and impending rain. Caleb leaned against the warped wooden post of the mercantile, his thumbs hooked into the loops of his denim trousers. He watched the horizon where the stagecoach trail snaked through the foothills. His jaw ticked. He had paid a Denver matrimonial agency $20 hard-earned dollars for a woman who understood survival. The advertisement had been blunt. Wanted wife. Must endure isolation, brutal winters, and relentless labor. Weak constitutions need not apply. The coach breached the ridge, its wooden wheels rattling like a dying man's cough. Caleb pushed off the post. He wasn't a man given to hope. Hope was a useless commodity at 9,000 feet elevation. You couldn't eat it, and you couldn't burn it for warmth. He just needed a second set of hands to haul water chop kindling and help butcher the elk before the snow locked them in. The stagecoach skidded to a halt in front of the depot. The horses were lathered, blowing hard in the cooling autumn air. The driver, a grizzled man with half his teeth missing, kicked the brake. He didn't look at Caleb. He just jerked a thumb towards the cabin door. A gloved hand emerged first. The leather was a ridiculous, pristine shade of cream. Caleb's stomach dropped. Josephine Carmichael stepped down into the mud of Bitter Creek. She wore a traveling suit of deep burgundy velvet completely unsuited for the raw wind sweeping off the mountains. A ridiculous hat pinned with a pheasant feather sat atop immaculate dark curls. She did not look at the mud ruining the hem of her skirt. She looked straight ahead, her pale eyes sweeping the dilapidated storefronts with a terrifyingly calm indifference. Caleb stepped forward, his heavy boots making no sound on the packed dirt. "You're the Carmichael woman?" It wasn't a question. Josephine turned her head. She took in his massive frame, the rough spun wool of his coat, the unkempt beard, and the scar that bisected his left eyebrow. She didn't flinch. "I am, and you are Mr. Boyd." Her voice was smooth, educated, and completely out of place. It sounded like crystal clinking in a quiet room. Caleb hated it immediately. "I asked the agency for a worker." Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't offer to take the small satchel she held. "I told them to send me someone who knew which end of an axe to hold. They sent me a porcelain doll." Josephine's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "The agency sent you the only woman desperate enough to answer an advertisement that sounded like a prison sentence. I assume my trunks are strapped to the back." "I ain't hauling trunks," Caleb said, staring her down. "Whatever you have in there won't do you any good where we're going. Leave them." "If my trunks stay, I stay," Josephine replied evenly. "And since you paid $20 for my presents, I suggest you tell the driver to unstrap them." Caleb's jaw clenched. He could leave her here. He could turn his wagon around, head back up the mountain, and face the winter alone. But the memory of the silence from last January crept up his spine, the suffocating, maddening quiet. He swore under his breath, stepping past her to the rear of the coach. It took him 20 minutes to load her 3 massive leather trunks into the back of his buckboard. Every time he hoisted one, he felt a fresh wave of irritation. They were heavy with useless things. Books, probably. Silk dresses, silver hairbrushes. Things that would freeze and crack in the high country. "Get in," he muttered, tossing his own canvas sack onto the wagon bed. Josephine walked to the side of the wagon. She looked at the high wooden seat, then at her restricting velvet skirt. She didn't ask for help. She grabbed the iron handle, dug the toe of her delicate boot into the wooden spoke of the wheel, and hauled herself up. Her breathing hitched a momentary betrayal of physical weakness, but she settled onto the hard bench and folded her hands in her lap. Caleb climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue at his draft horses. The wagon lurched forward. They rode in silence for the first 3 hours. The road out of Bitter Creek was less a road, and more a suggestion of a path, carved deeply with ruts from ore wagons. With every jolt, Caleb saw Josephine's teeth clack together. The temperature was dropping steadily as they climbed. The sparse pines gave way to dense, towering spruce and fir. The wind grew sharper, slicing through the thin velvet of her jacket. She began to shiver. It was a subtle thing at first, a slight tremble in her shoulders. Then her teeth started chattering. Caleb didn't look at her. "Told you that coat was useless. It is perfectly fine," she managed to say, her voice vibrating. He reached behind the seat, with one hand grabbed a heavy-smelling sheepskin blanket and tossed it onto her lap. "Wrap up. If you die of exposure on the trail, I still gotta dig the grave, and the ground's getting hard." Josephine didn't argue. She pulled the heavy, foul-smelling hide around her shoulders, burying her face in the coarse wool. She smelled like rosewater. The blanket smelled like sweat and sheep tallow. Caleb watched out of the corner of his eye as her nose wrinkled in disgust, but she pulled it tighter. They reached the cabin just as the sun bled out behind the western peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the clearing. The structure was rough-hewn, built of massive logs caulked with mud and horsehair. A tin chimney poked out of a sod roof. It was sturdy. It was warm. It was absolutely barren of anything resembling comfort. Caleb pulled the team to a halt. "We're here." Josephine peered out from beneath the sheepskin. She stared at the small, dark cabin, then at the impenetrable wall of black forest surrounding it. There were no neighbors. There was no town. There was only the wind howling through the spruce. For the first time, Caleb saw something crack in her pale, aristocratic face. It was stark, raw terror. "Home," Caleb said cynically, jumping down into the dirt. "Grab your satchel. Fire needs lighting." Morning broke like shattered glass, pale, sharp, and freezing. Josephine woke with a gasp, her breath pluming in the frigid air of the cabin. She was lying on a mattress stuffed with dried corn husks that crackled loudly with her every movement. A scratchy wool blanket provided her only defense against the cold that seemed to seep straight through the log walls. She lay still for a moment, staring at the exposed rafters. The reality of her situation pressed down on her chest like a physical weight. Philadelphia was a lifetime away. The creditors who had picked apart her father's estate after his sudden death, the society matrons who had turned their backs, the realization that her only asset left was her unattached status. She had sold herself to a mountain man for survival, and the survival looked remarkably like a slow, freezing death. A heavy thud outside rattled the window pane. Caleb was already up. Josephine threw off the blanket and immediately curled in on herself. The cold was a living thing in the room. She forced herself to stand on the bare floorboards, her bare feet aching instantly. She found her satchel and pulled out a plain cotton day dress, leaving the velvet packed away. She struggled with the buttons, her fingers numb and clumsy. The corset she abandoned entirely. She couldn't lace it herself, and she suspected it would only restrict the labor she was inevitably expected to perform. She walked into the main room. It was small, dominated by a heavy, rough-hewn table and a massive black iron stove. On the table sat a tin cup and a bucket of water. A thin layer of ice coated the top of the bucket. Josephine stared at the black iron stove. It was unlit. Caleb had left her to start the fire. She had never lit a fire in her life. Servants did that before she woke. She approached the iron beast, studying its soot-stained door. Beside it lay a pile of split wood, some twisted newspaper, and a small box of lucifer matches. "How hard could it be?" she whispered, her voice rough from the cold. She opened the iron door, her hands leaving clean tracks in the layer of grime. She shoved several large logs into the belly of the stove, crammed a few sheets of newspaper underneath them, and struck a match. The paper caught, quickly flaring up with a bright, cheerful light. Josephine smiled, a brief flutter of triumph warming her chest. 30 seconds later, the paper burned out. The thick logs remained completely untouched, sitting stubbornly in the ash. She frowned. She took out more paper, shoving it deeper, and lit it again. The same result. After 5 attempts, she began piling the paper on top of the logs, then cramming smaller pieces of bark around the edges. She lit 3 matches at once and threw them in. This time, the bark caught. But instead of drawing the smoke up, the chimney thick, acrid grey smoke billowed out of the open door, pouring into the small room. Josephine coughed violently, stepping back and waving her hands. Her eyes watered, stinging fiercely. The smoke filled the cabin, choking out the cold air with something far worse. The heavy wooden front door swung open. The wind rushed in, clearing a path through the smoke. Caleb stood in the doorway, an axe resting easily on his broad shoulder. He looked at the billowing smoke, then at Josephine, who was coughing into her hands, her face streaked with soot. He didn't yell. That made it worse. He just slowly lowered the axe, walked over to the stove, and kicked the iron door shut. The smoke immediately began to draw up the chimney. "You smothered it," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You didn't use kindling, you packed the wood too tight, and you left the draft closed. The paper burned, starved for air, and smoked." Josephine coughed again, wiping her watering eyes. "I tried. Trying doesn't keep you from freezing to death, Miss Carmichael," Caleb said, turning to face her. His dark eyes were merciless. "Out here, incompetence is a death sentence. You can't charm a blizzard. You can't buy off a frozen water pump. If you don't know how to keep a fire lit, you die." Josephine stood tall, ignoring the stinging in her eyes. Her lungs burned. She looked at his weathered face, the deep lines etched around his mouth. He wasn't being cruel. He was stating a fact. The cynicism in his tone wasn't aimed at her specifically, but at her entire world, a world he believed made her soft and useless. "Then teach me," she said. The words hung in the cold air. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He had expected tears. He had expected hysterics, or a demand to be returned to the stagecoach depot. He had not expected the flat, hard resolve in her soot-stained face. "I don't have time to be a schoolmaster," Caleb grunted, turning back to the door. "I have meat to smoke and wood to chop. Then I will come with you," Josephine said, taking a step forward. "And you will show me how to chop wood. If I must be useful to survive Mr. Boyd, I suggest you stop complaining about my ignorance and start fixing it." Caleb stopped in the doorway. He looked over his shoulder. The heiress was trembling from the cold, wearing a thin cotton dress, her hair escaping its neat pins, her face smeared with ash. She looked ridiculous. She looked entirely out of her depth. But her chin was up, and her pale eyes held a startling, fierce light. He turned away, hiding the slight shift in his expression. "Put your boots on, and find a heavier coat. I'm not carrying your frozen corpse back down the mountain." Josephine exhaled a shaky breath as the door clicked shut behind him. She looked down at her soft, manicured hands. They were trembling. She walked over to her satchel, dug past the useless velvet and lace, and pulled out a pair of heavy leather riding gloves. She strapped on her boots. When she stepped outside, the wind hit her like a physical blow. Caleb was by the woodpile, swinging a heavy splitting maul with terrifying ease. Thwack! A log split perfectly in two. He didn't look up as she approached. "Pick up the pieces," he ordered over the sound of the wind. "Stack them against the cabin wall, bark side down to keep the moisture out." Josephine didn't say a word. She bent down, grabbed a piece of rough, splintered pine, and carried it to the wall. The wood was heavy, sappy, and rough. By her 10th trip, her back screamed in protest. By her 20th trip, she felt the unmistakable burn of a blister forming at the base of her thumb, right through the leather of her riding gloves. She kept walking. The mountain man wanted a worker. She would break her own back before she let him send her away. Frost hardened the mud around the cabin into sharp, unyielding ridges. Over the next 2 weeks, Josephine learned that survival was not a grand, heroic struggle. Survival was a series of relentless, miserable chores. It was hauling water from the creek until her shoulders screamed. It was scraping ash from the belly of the iron stove, her fingernails stained, permanently grey. It was learning to slice salt pork thin enough to fry without burning the fat. She did not complain. She simply worked until her body gave out, slept heavily on the rustling corn husks, and woke up to do it again. Caleb watched her with a wary, silent detachment. He expected her to break. Every morning he looked for the tears. Every evening he waited for the demand to be taken back down the mountain. The demands never came. Instead, the expensive leather riding gloves she wore deteriorated. The soft seams split under the friction of rough pine bark and axe handles. Blood began to seep through the tears in the leather, staining the pale cream, a rusty brown. He noticed. He didn't say anything. A softer man might have told her to stop, might have offered to do the heavy lifting himself. Caleb was not a soft man. He knew that if she didn't callous now, the deep winter would kill her. Pity was a luxury that cost lives. Late one afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruised iron skillet. The air grew perfectly, eerily still. The birds stopped calling. Caleb walked out of the tree line, dragging the carcass of a massive mule deer by its antlers. Its tongue lolled in the dirt. Blood smeared a trail across the frosted grass. Josephine stood by the water pump, a heavy wooden bucket resting against her hip. She watched him approach. Her stomach gave a violent, involuntary heave at the smell of raw copper and ruptured bowels. She swallowed hard, forcing the bile back down her throat. Caleb dropped the antlers near the chopping block. He pulled a long, bone-handled skinning knife from his belt. He looked at her, his expression unreadable beneath his thick beard. "Water's going to freeze in the pump tonight. We need to process this meat before it goes stiff. Get the sharpening stone from the mantel." She set the bucket down. Her legs felt weak. In Philadelphia, meat arrived neatly wrapped in brown butcher paper, devoid of eyes fur or the steaming stench of death. She walked into the cabin, retrieved the grey stone, and brought it out to him. "Hold the legs," Caleb ordered. He didn't ask if she was squeamish. He didn't care. Josephine stepped over the pooling blood. She grabbed the deer's hind legs. The fur was coarse, the muscle underneath still holding a terrible fading warmth. Caleb began to work. He moved with brutal efficiency. The knife sliced through hide and membrane with a wet, ripping sound. Steam rose from the opened chest cavity, hitting the freezing air. The smell hit Josephine like a physical blow-musk iron and digesting grass. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away, but her grip on the animal's legs did not loosen. "Keep tension on it," Caleb grunted, pulling the hide back. "If it sags, I'll cut the meat. Waste the meat, we go hungry in February." She pulled harder. Her torn gloves offered no protection against the coarse hair. The deer's blood slicked her fingers warm and terrifyingly sticky. For 2 hours they worked in the fading, freezing light. Caleb quartered the animal, separating roasts from stew meat, hacking through bone with a heavy cleaver. Josephine carried the heavy, dripping slabs into the smokehouse, hanging them on iron hooks. Her cotton dress was ruined, smeared with dark crimson. Her arms shook violently with every trip. By the time they finished, darkness had swallowed the clearing. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the cabin windows. They washed their hands at the pump in silence. The water was agonizingly cold, turning Josephine's numb fingers a mottled, violent purple. The blood washed away, but the smell remained. It clung to her skin, to her hair, to the very back of her throat. Caleb shut the pump off. He looked at her hands in the dim light. The leather gloves were completely destroyed, hanging in tatters. Beneath them, her palms were a mess of raw, busted blisters and angry red skin. He looked away, his jaw working tight. "First snow is coming tonight, a big one." I know, Josephine said quietly. Her voice was flat, hollowed out by exhaustion. You did all right today, Carmichael. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given her. It felt like a stone dropping into a deep, empty well. Josephine didn't smile. She just picked up her water bucket, carrying it toward the cabin door. She didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. They both knew the real test hadn't even begun. Snow did not fall. It drove sideways. It hit the cabin walls like handfuls of gravel, a relentless shrieking assault that drowned out every other sound in the world. Josephine woke in pitch darkness. The cold in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made her lungs ache. The fire in the stove had died overnight. She sat up, pulling the scratchy blanket tight around her shoulders. She couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. The window was entirely obscured by a solid white wall of drifted snow. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her feet hit the floorboards and recoiled. The wood felt like blocks of ice. She fumbled in the dark for her boots, her fingers stiff and uncooperative. A match flared from the corner of the room. Caleb stood by the stove, a ghostly figure illuminated by the sudden yellow light. He touched the match to a kerosene lantern. The soft glow pushed back the darkness, revealing the condensation frozen solid on the inside of the logs. Don't bother with the boots yet. Caleb said, his voice a low gravel rumble over the roaring wind. We aren't going anywhere. Doors drifted shut. 3 feet at least, and it's still coming down. Josephine pulled her legs back up under the blanket. The claustrophobia hit her instantly. In the city, a snowstorm meant a day indoors, reading by the fire servants, bringing hot tea. Here it meant a white tomb. Caleb opened the stove door. He didn't struggle with the fire anymore. He laid the kindling with practiced precision, striking a match and coaxing a blaze into life within seconds. The dry wood popped, sending a localized, desperate heat into the small room. He set a kettle of snow on the iron top to melt. Then he turned to look at her. Josephine sat huddled on her mattress, her knees pulled to her chest. Her hair was a tangled mess. She looked small, bruised, and profoundly exhausted. But her eyes tracked his movements with a sharp, guarded intelligence. Bring your hands here, Caleb commanded. Josephine hesitated. She looked down at her palms. The blisters from the firewood and the deer processing had torn open completely. The raw flesh was weeping a clear fluid, the edges rimmed with angry, inflamed red tissue. They throbbed with a low, ceaseless heartbeat of pain. They are fine, she lied. Caleb crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't ask again. He reached down, grasped her wrists gently but with immovable strength, and pulled her hands into the lantern light. He stared at the mangled flesh. His breath hitched a tiny, nearly imperceptible sound in the quiet cabin. He had seen men scream over lesser wounds. He had seen them drop their tools and quit. She hadn't made a single sound. You're an idiot, Carmichael, he said softly, his thumbs grazing the uninjured skin of her wrists. Infection sets in out here, you lose the hand. Sometimes you lose the arm. I was trying to be useful. She snapped back, trying to pull her hands away. He didn't let go. There's a line between useful and reckless. Caleb replied. He dropped her wrists and walked to a small wooden shelf above the washbasin. He pulled down a tin of yellowish salve and a roll of clean, torn cotton strips. He pulled up a heavy wooden chair sitting directly facing her bed. He opened the tin. It smelled fiercely of pine pitch and something deeply medicinal. Give them here. She slowly extended her trembling hands. Caleb took her right hand in his massive calloused palm. His fingers were rough-scarred from years of heavy labor and violence, but his touch was surprisingly deliberate. He scooped a dollop of the strong-smelling salve onto his thumb and began to work it into the raw meat of her palm. Josephine hissed, her whole body jerking as the alcohol and pitch bit into the open wounds. "Hold still!" Caleb murmured. He didn't look up at her face. He kept his eyes locked on her hand. "Why did you stay that first day at the depot? I gave you an out. You could have gotten right back on that stage." The wind battered the roof above them, threatening to tear the shingles free. Josephine stared at the top of his head, at the thick, dark hair, and the broad, tense line of his shoulders. "I had no money for a return ticket," she said flatly. The truth tasted like ash. "My father died of a heart attack in June. He left nothing but debts. The bank took the house, the horses, the furniture. My friends suddenly stopped calling. The matrimonial agency paid my fare here. It was this or the streets." Caleb paused. He looked up at her. The lantern light threw deep shadows across his face, highlighting the scar on his brow. The cynicism in his eyes had retreated, replaced by a quiet, heavy understanding. He knew about dead ends. He knew about the places people went when the world chewed them up and spit them out. "And you?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Why buy a wife? You clearly hate the company." Caleb picked up the roll of cotton. He began to wrap her hand, pulling the fabric tight enough to secure the salve, but loose enough not to bind her joints. "Because a man shouldn't be alone for 7 months in the snow," he said quietly. He tied off the bandage. "The silence out here. It gets loud. Starts whispering to you. Tells you things about yourself you don't want to hear. My brother died in a storm like this 3 years ago. Went out to check the trap line. Found him in the spring." He reached for her left hand. "I didn't buy a wife, Josephine. I bought an anchor. Something to keep me from floating away into the quiet." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it spoken in his rough, quiet voice over the howling wind sent a strange jolt through her chest. She looked at her bandaged hand. Then she looked at the mountain man sitting in front of her. The Pampered Heiress and the cynical trapper locked in a dark box at the end of the world. "Well," Josephine said softly, wincing as he applied the salve to her left hand, "I suppose we are both anchored now." 3 days passed before the wind finally broke its siege. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute ringing in Josephine's ears after 72 hours of relentless roaring. When Caleb finally pushed the heavy oak door open, a solid wall of packed white snow blocked their exit. It was packed so tight by the wind it resembled marble. Caleb took a flat-edged iron shovel from the corner. He didn't speak. He just began to carve away at the barrier. Josephine stood behind him in the cold draught. Her hand, still wrapped in the pine-scented cotton strips, throbbed with a dull ache, but the weeping blisters had sealed. Caleb tossed blocks of hard-packed snow back into the cabin. Josephine used a large tin wash basin to drag the debris toward the stove, letting it melt into the buckets. It was a slow, agonizing process. By noon, Caleb broke through the drift. The sunlight pouring into the tunnel was blinding, bouncing off the pristine white landscape with a harsh violet glare. Josephine stepped out behind him, squinting violently. The world she knew was gone. The creek, the dirt path, the stumps of felled trees, everything was erased under 4 feet of unbroken snow. The pine trees sagged under the immense weight their branches pulled low to the ground. It was beautiful in a terrifying, deadly way. "Trench to the woodpile first." Caleb grunted his breath, pluming in the still air. "Then the horses. They'll be hungry." He carved a narrow path through the drifts, tossing the snow high over his shoulders. Josephine followed, her heavy boots sinking into the loose powder at the bottom of the trench. She carried the empty canvas feed bags. The lean-to that housed Caleb's 2 massive draft horses was almost entirely buried, but the animals were alive, their deep rumbling nickers greeting them as Caleb cleared the stall doors. They worked until the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the snowfields in shades of bruised purple and deep indigo. By the time they retreated to the cabin, Josephine's muscles were trembling so violently she could barely hold her tin cup of coffee. Caleb sat across from her at the rough table. He watched her wrap her cold fingers around the steaming metal. He had spent the last 3 days observing her in the cramped confines of the cabin. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't complained about the monotonous diet of salt pork and dried beans. She had watched him learn the draft of the stove and figured out how to keep the fire banked overnight without smothering it. She was adapting. It unsettled him. "Your coat is torn," Josephine said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. Caleb looked down at his right shoulder. A jagged tear in the thick canvas exposed the sheepskin lining beneath. He must have caught it on a nail in the horse stalls. "I'll patch it." "You chop the wood," Josephine countered, setting her cup down. "I will sew the coat." Caleb met her gaze. He considered arguing, but his shoulders ached from hours of shoveling. He stripped the heavy coat off and tossed it across the table. It landed with a heavy, dull thud smelling of horse-sweat wood smoke and cold air. Josephine retrieved a small wooden sewing box from her satchel. It was one of the few practical things she had brought. She pulled a thick steel needle and heavy waxed thread from the compartments. She slid closer to the lantern, turning the heavy canvas over in her lap. Her fingers were stiff, the bandages making her clumsy. She struggled to push the needle through the dense fabric. Caleb watched her wince as the pressure aggravated her healing palms. "Leave it," he said roughly. "It's too thick for those hands right now." Josephine ignored him. She positioned the eye of the needle against the wooden table, pressing the canvas down onto the point to force it through. "I said I would do it. I am not useless, Mr. Boyd." He didn't reply. He leaned back in his chair, watching the top of her dark head. The lantern light caught the subtle copper highlights in her hair. She worked for an hour, her brow furrowed in concentration. The stitches were not delicate. They were brutal, functional, and heavily knotted. It was an ugly repair, but it would hold against a gale. When she finished, she bit the thread and smoothed the canvas flat. She pushed the coat back across the table. Caleb ran his thumb over the thick ridge of her stitching. It was tough, unyielding. "Much obliged." Josephine nodded slowly, packing away her needles. "I need to know how to shoot the rifle." Caleb's hand stopped on the coat. He looked up, his dark eyes narrowing. "Why, because if you break your leg in the woods or if a tree falls on you, I cannot drag you back," she stated matter-of-factly, her pale eyes unflinching. "And I refuse to starve to death waiting for spring because I cannot kill an elk." The absolute pragmatism in her voice caught him off guard. She wasn't asking for empowerment, she was asking for insurance. She looked at the brutal reality of their existence and demanded the tools to fight it. A slow, barely perceptible smirk touched the corner of Caleb's mouth beneath his beard. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen on him. "Tomorrow, after we haul the wood, I'll show you how to load the Winchester. January brought a cold so severe it snapped the spruce branches like dry bones. The sound echoed through the valley like rifle fire, keeping Josephine awake in the dead of night. The cabin was an island in a vast, frozen ocean. The routine had hardened into a strict rhythm. Wake in the dark, break the ice in the buckets, haul wood, feed the horses, check the perimeter, survive. Josephine's hands had healed into thick, unyielding calluses. The aristocratic softness was gone, replaced by cracked knuckles and grim strength. She could lift a full bucket of water without shaking. She could load cock and fire the heavy Winchester rifle, though the recoil bruised her shoulder purple every time. Caleb had stopped giving her orders. He didn't have to. She knew what needed to be done, and she did it. They moved around each other in the small space with an unspoken choreography. They were entirely alone, reliant on no one but the person across the table. The cynical silence that had defined their early days had shifted into something else. It was a comfortable quiet, a shared weight. One night the temperature plummeted past 30 below zero. The logs of the cabin groaned under the contracting cold. Josephine was asleep, buried under 3 heavy wool blankets and a buffalo hide. A sound tore through the dark. It was high, raspy, and utterly terrifying. It sounded like a woman screaming in agony right outside the frosted window. Josephine bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. Caleb was already out of bed. In the pitch black, she heard the metallic clack of him jacking a shell into the chamber of the Winchester. "Stay inside." Caleb ordered, his voice a low, harsh whisper. He shoved his feet into his boots and threw his heavy canvas coat over his thermal shirt. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Mountain lion. Starving if it's down this low. It's after the horses." He didn't wait for her reply. He threw the heavy wooden bar off the door and slipped out into the howling dark, pulling the door shut behind him to keep the heat in. Josephine sat in the dark, her breath catching in her throat. The screaming sound echoed again, this time from the direction of the lean-to. She heard the draft horses kicking violently against the heavy wooden stalls, snorting in absolute terror. Then silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. She waited for the sharp crack of Caleb's rifle. 1 minute passed, then 2. Nothing. Adrenaline flooded her veins cold and sharp. She threw off the blankets, ignoring the freezing air biting at her skin. She pulled on her boots over bare feet. She walked to the corner by the door, reaching into the shadows. Caleb's shotgun, a heavy double-barreled 10-gauge, rested against the logs. It was loaded with buckshot. He kept it there for close-range emergencies. She grabbed the heavy oak stock. It was cold enough to burn her palms. She cracked the door open. The wind was dead, but the cold was a physical wall. The moon was a sliver of ice in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the blue snow. She stepped out her breath, freezing instantly on her eyelashes. She moved slowly towards the trench that led to the horses. She kept the heavy shotgun raised, her finger resting cautiously near the trigger guard. "Caleb," she called softly. No answer. She reached the edge of the lean-to. The horses were still kicking frantic. She peered around the corner of the rough-hewn timber. Caleb was on the ground. He had slipped on a patch of slick ice hidden beneath the powder. His rifle lay 10 feet away in a snowdrift. Standing over him, perched on the heavy lower beam of the horse stall, was the mountain lion. It was gaunt, its ribs showing through its tawny coat, making it desperate and incredibly dangerous. Its ears were pinned flat against its skull, pale yellow eyes, locked on the man in the snow. It dropped into a low crouch, its powerful hind legs coiling to spring. Josephine didn't think. She didn't scream. She stepped out from the corner, raised the heavy 10-gauge to her shoulder, and aimed center mass at the beast. She pulled the front trigger. The blast ripped the night in half. The recoil was a brutal physical punch that knocked Josephine flat on her back into the deep snow. A deafening roar filled her ears, a ringing that completely blocked out the world. Her shoulder flared with agonizing pain. She struggled to sit up, gasping for air, clutching the empty gun. Smoke hung heavy in the freezing air, smelling of sulfur and burnt powder. Caleb was on his feet. He had his hunting knife drawn, standing over a dark, thrashing mass in the snow. It went still. He didn't look at the dead cat. He turned, dropping the knife, and waded through the snow to where Josephine was sitting up. He dropped to his knees beside her, his massive hands grabbing her shoulders. "Josephine!" He breathed, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. He was checking her for blood, his eyes wide, the stoic mask completely shattered. "Are you hit? Did it touch you?" "No!" She gasped, her teeth chattering violently as the adrenaline crashed. "The gun. It kicked." Caleb stared at her. Her hair was loose, blowing wildly in the night air. She was wearing a thin cotton nightdress and heavy boots, sitting in 3 feet of snow with a 10-gauge shotgun across her lap. She had just killed a 200-pound predator at 10 paces. He exhaled a long, shaky breath. He reached under her arms and hauled her to her feet, pulling her tight against his chest. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was the desperate grip of a man who had almost lost the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "You're freezing," he muttered, burying his face in her dark hair for a fraction of a second. "Inside. Now." He kept one arm firmly wrapped around her waist, practically carrying her back down the trench to the cabin. When he kicked the heavy door shut, sealing them back in the warm, dim light of the stove, he finally let her go. He walked over to the stove, throwing 3 large logs into the firebox. He didn't speak. He just stood there staring at the flames, his broad back rising and falling heavily. Josephine sat on the edge of her bed, rubbing her bruised shoulder. She waited for him to yell at her for leaving the cabin. She waited for the cynical remark. Caleb turned around. He looked at her entirely ruined aristocratic hands, her dirt-smudged face, and the fierce, uncompromising light in her eyes. "I bought a worker," Caleb said quietly, the gravel in his voice completely gone. "I thought I brought home a porcelain doll." He walked slowly across the room, stopping inches from her. He reached out his rough, calloused fingers, gently brushing a stray curl away from her freezing cheek. "I was wrong," he whispered. "You're iron, Josephine." February brought a stillness that felt heavier than the snow itself. The wind died completely, leaving the bitterroots locked in a deep, crystalline freeze. Trees snapped under the cold with the sound of cannon fire echoing across the white valleys. Inside the cabin, the space between Caleb and Josephine had fundamentally shifted. The vast, empty silence that Caleb had feared was gone. In its place was a quiet, living rhythm. Caleb spent 2 days processing the mountain lion. The meat was tough, stringy, and tasted of desperation, but they boiled it down into thick stews. Waste was a sin in the high country. He scraped the hide clean, staking it out to cure in the freezing, dry air. Every time he looked at the massive claws, a cold knot pulled tight in his gut. 10 paces. She had stood her ground at 10 paces. Josephine paid for that stand. The recoil of the heavy 10-gauge had done brutal work on her shoulder. By the second morning, the bruise bloomed across her collarbone and down her bicep, a terrifying canvas of deep, violet, sickly yellow and crushed black. She tried to hide it. She hauled water with her left hand, favoring her right side, her jaw clamped tight against the pain. Caleb watched her wince as she reached for a cast-iron skillet. He set down his skinning knife and crossed the small room. "Take the dress off," he said. His voice was completely flat, leaving no room for argument. Josephine froze her hand, hovering over the stove. She looked over her shoulder. Caleb wasn't looking at her with any sort of untoward intent. He was looking at the stiff, unnatural angle of her right arm. "It's just a bruise," she said, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. "It's a deep tissue contusion, and if you keep pulling the muscle, it's going to freeze up on you entirely. You won't be able to lift a coffee cup, let alone an axe." He pointed to the heavy wooden chair near the fire. "Sit." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before abandoning the skillet. She sat in the chair, her back rigid. Caleb walked to his small chest of medical supplies. He retrieved a dark glass bottle of arnica liniment and a clean strip of cotton. He stood behind her. Josephine swallowed hard, staring at the glowing embers in the stove. Her fingers moved to the top buttons of her cotton day dress. She undid the first 3, her hands clumsy. She pulled the fabric down, slipping it off her right shoulder. Her pale skin was a stark contrast to the angry, swollen mass of bruised flesh. She heard Caleb inhale sharply behind her. The sound was small, but in the quiet cabin it was deafening. "You didn't say it was this bad," he murmured. "I have survived worse in this cabin, Mr. Boyd." She replied softly. "Caleb," he corrected her. He poured the strong-smelling liniment onto the cotton cloth. "My name is Caleb. I reckon we're past titles." He pressed the cloth to her skin. The liniment was shockingly cold, but the pressure of his hands was warm. He began to work the fluid into the bruised muscle. His touch was incredibly slow. He was a man who butchered elk and felled pines, yet his fingers traced the edge of her collarbone with a careful, deliberate reverence. Josephine let out a long, shaky breath, her eyes fluttering shut. The pain was sharp, but the heat of his hands drew the tension out of her back. "I didn't think you'd pull the trigger," Caleb said quietly, his thumbs working the knot at the base of her neck. "Most men I know would have froze up. That cat was fast. I didn't have time to freeze," she answered, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I just knew that if he killed you I would die up here alone. It was entirely selfish." Caleb stopped rubbing. His hands rested heavy and still on her bare shoulder. He looked down at the dark, messy curls pinned to the nape of her neck. He knew she was lying. He had seen her eyes when she pulled that trigger. It wasn't fear of starvation he saw. It was a fierce, desperate instinct to protect him. "You wouldn't have died," Caleb said. His voice was thick, vibrating in his chest. "You're too stubborn to die, Josephine." He didn't step back. He let his thumb drag slowly across her unbruised skin, a silent acknowledgement of the terrifying fragility of their lives. For months they had treated each other as necessary equipment tools for survival. But sitting in the dim light, the smell of arnica and wood smoke thick in the air, the raw truth settled over them. They were no longer just surviving. They were keeping each other alive. Josephine leaned back just a fraction of an inch. Her skin brushed against the heavy canvas of his shirt. It was an incredibly small movement, a tiny surrender to the exhaustion and the isolation. Caleb's breath hitched. He didn't pull away. He stood there in the quiet, his hands resting on her shoulders, the roaring silence of the winter held entirely at bay by the warmth of the small iron stove and the steady beating of their hearts. The illusion of safety cracked in early March. The mountain men called it the false thaw. For 3 days the sun beat down with surprising heat, turning the top layer of snow into a slushy, reflective glare. Then the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single afternoon. The slush froze into solid, impenetrable ice. It was during the deep freeze that Caleb started coughing. It began as a dry, rattling hack deep in his chest. He ignored it. He went out to break the ice over the creek, wielding the heavy steel spud bar for hours in the biting wind. By the time he returned to the cabin, his skin was flushed a dull, waxy grey, and his eyes were completely bloodshot. Josephine watched him stumble as he crossed the threshold. He didn't bother taking off his boots. He dropped the iron bar, staggered toward the rough-hewn table, and collapsed into the chair. His breathing was shallow and incredibly fast. "Caleb." She dropped her mending and crossed the room. He looked up at her, but his eyes didn't seem to focus. "Just need a minute to catch my wind." He didn't get a minute. A violent spasm of coughing seized him, folding his massive frame in half. The sound was wet and horrifyingly deep. When he pulled his hand away from his mouth, there was a stark, bright fleck of blood on his knuckles. Panic sharp and metallic tasted like copper in Josephine's mouth. Lung fever. Out here it was a death sentence faster than a cougar or a blizzard. "Get up," she ordered, her voice completely stripped of panic. She grabbed his heavy canvas arm and hauled him upward. He was dead weight, his muscles weak with sudden spiking fever. She dragged him to the bed. He fell onto the corn husk mattress with a heavy groan. Within an hour the fever took him entirely. He began to thrash, kicking off the heavy wool blankets, slick with freezing sweat. He muttered incoherently, his voice rough and terrified. Speaking to ghosts Josephine couldn't see. He called out for a man named Thomas, his brother, the one the snow had swallowed 3 years ago. Josephine didn't stop moving. The quiet heiress from Philadelphia was gone. In her place was a woman forged by the bitterroots. She stoked the fire until the iron belly of the stove glowed a dull cherry red. She hauled water, boiled it, and threw handfuls of dried pine needles into the pot. The sharp menthol scent filled the small cabin. She dragged the heavy iron pot to the side of his bed, forcing him to breathe in the steam, holding his broad shoulders down when he tried to fight her in his delirium. For 3 days and 3 nights she did not sleep. The physical toll was immense. She had to do his chores and hers. She took the splitting maul to the woodpile, her back screaming as she chopped through frozen, sappy pine just to keep the cabin from turning into an icebox. She fed the horses, her hands numb, her face wrapped in a wool scarf against the biting wind. Every time she left the cabin, terror gripped her throat, fear that when she returned, the rattle in his chest would have stopped. On the third night, the wind picked up again, howling against the mud-chinked logs. Caleb was burning up. His skin radiated a dry, terrifying heat. He grabbed her wrist as she tried to press a cool, damp cloth to his forehead. His grip was shockingly weak. "Joe." He slurred his eyes wide, staring at the dark rafters. "The snow. It's too deep. Can't dig him out." "Caleb, look at me," she said fiercely, leaning over him. She pressed her cold, rough hands against his burning cheeks. "You are in the cabin. Thomas is gone. You are here with me." His gaze shifted, struggling to find her face in the dim lantern light. His chest heaved. "It's so quiet. Don't let it get quiet." "I won't," she whispered, her voice cracking for the very first time. A single hot tear escaped her eye, tracking through the soot and dirt on her cheek to fall onto his jaw. "I am your anchor. Remember, I am not letting you drift away. You do not get to leave me here, Caleb Boyd." She sat on the floor beside the bed, pulling his massive, fever-weakened hand into her lap. She held it against her chest. To keep the silence away, she talked. She didn't talk about Philadelphia or high society or the debts her father left. She talked about the cabin. She talked about the way the spruce trees looked against the violet sky at dusk. She talked about how to properly slice salt pork so it wouldn't burn. She anchored him to the brutal, beautiful world they had carved out together. Sometime near dawn, the grip on her hand loosened. Josephine jerked awake, her heart stopping in her chest. She had dozed off against the frame of the bed. She looked at Caleb. His breathing had changed. The wet, desperate rattle was gone. It was slow, deep, steady. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched his forehead. The terrifying dry heat had broken. His skin was cool and damp with sweat. He was sleeping. Truly sleeping. Josephine slumped back against the floorboards. She looked at her raw, calloused hands covered in dirt and pine sap. She looked at the man in the bed, breathing steadily in the quiet cabin. She closed her eyes, letting the absolute exhaustion pull her down into the dark. They had beaten the winter. April did not arrive with gentle breezes or budding wildflowers. It came violently, tearing the snowpack apart with torrential rains and a sudden blistering sun. The mountain did not thaw. It bled. Water rushed everywhere, turning the steep slopes into treacherous chutes of mud and exposed granite. The creek, frozen solid for 6 months, transformed into a deafening, frothing torrent of grey runoff that threatened to breach its banks. Caleb sat on a heavy wooden stump near the cabin door. His breathing was normal, but the lung fever had stripped 15 pounds of muscle from his frame. His heavy canvas coat hung loosely on his broad shoulders. He hated the weakness in his limbs. He hated sitting while someone else worked. He watched Josephine. She was standing near the mud-soaked perimeter of the horse paddock, holding a pitchfork. She wore a pair of his old denim trousers rolled up at the cuffs and a thermal undershirt stained with axle grease and dirt. Her heavy velvet traveling suit was entirely forgotten, likely rotting at the bottom of her leather trunk. She drove the pitchfork into a pile of soiled, wet hay, leveraging her weight against the wooden handle, and heaved it over the fence. She didn't move with the frantic, desperate energy of her first month. She moved with a slow, deliberate economy of force. She had learned the mountain's rhythm. Expend only what is necessary. Save the rest for tomorrow. Caleb rubbed his jaw, feeling the coarse, unkempt tangle of his beard. He looked away from her, staring down the mountain. The stagecoach trail, buried since November, was a visible scar of dark mud cutting through the receding white snowdrifts. It was passable. He stood up. His knees popped, a dull ache radiating up his shins. He walked into the cabin. The smell of wood smoke, boiled coffee, and the lingering scent of arnica liniment hung in the air. He walked to a heavy iron lockbox sitting on the floor near the head of his bed. He knelt, fishing a small brass key from his pocket, and twisted the lock. Inside sat a small stack of silver dollars and a handful of crumpled paper notes. He counted out $40. It was double what he had paid the Denver matrimonial agency. It was enough for a stagecoach ticket to San Francisco or back east, with enough left over for a hotel and a decent meal. He closed the box. He held the money in his fist, the edges of the coins digging into his calloused palm. When he walked back outside, Josephine was at the water pump. She worked the heavy iron handle up and down, filling a wooden trough for the horses. The sun caught the copper streaks in her dark, messy hair. She stopped pumping, wiping a streak of muddy water from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She saw him standing on the porch, staring at her. "You should be sitting," she called out over the roar of the creek. "If you relapse, I am not chopping another cord of wood to keep you warm." Her tone was sharp, practical, and completely devoid of pity. It was exactly what he needed. Caleb stepped off the porch. His boots sank an inch into the thick, sucking mud of the clearing. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. He looked at the water trough, then at the massive draft horses grazing on the first shoots of pale green grass. Finally, he looked at her. He held out his closed hand, then slowly opened his fingers. The silver coins and paper money sat heavy in his palm. Josephine stared at the money. Her pale eyes flicked up to his face. "What is that?" $40. Caleb set his voice a low, rough gravel. "The pass to Bitter Creek is clear. The mud is deep, but the buckboard can make it. Stagecoach will be running by the end of the week." The silence between them felt heavier than the winter snow. The roar of the creek seemed to fade into the background. "You bought me," Josephine said slowly, her voice dangerously quiet. "And now you are trying to pay me to leave. I am giving you your life back." Caleb corrected, his jaw tightening. "You answered a blind advertisement because you were broke and desperate. You survived. You didn't break. You did your job, Carmichael, but the snow is gone. You don't have to freeze out here anymore. Take the money. Go find a city where the water doesn't freeze in the bucket." Josephine did not reach for the money. She slowly leaned the pitchfork against the wooden post of the water pump. She took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between them. She lifted her hands. The leather riding gloves were long gone. Her skin was rough-scarred and permanently stained with sap and ash. The knuckles were thick, the palms covered in hard yellow calluses. "Look at my hands, Caleb," she demanded. Her voice didn't waver. "Do these look like hands that can hold a porcelain teacup? Do these look like hands that belong in a Philadelphia drawing room?" Caleb looked at the scars. He knew exactly how she got every single one of them. "I did not survive 6 months of bitter hell, kill a mountain lion at 10 paces, and drag you back from the edge of the grave just to be put on a wagon the moment the sun comes out," she stated, her pale eyes blazing with a fierce, uncompromising fire. "I am not a hired hand. I am not a temporary fixture." Caleb's chest tightened. He looked at her soot-stained thermal shirt, her muddy boots, and the terrifying, beautiful strength in her jaw. The cynicism that had protected him for years, the heavy armor he wore to keep the world at a distance, fractured completely. "It's a hard life, Joe," he whispered. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a plea for her to understand exactly what she was choosing. "It doesn't get easier. Winter always comes back. Then we will cut more wood," she replied flatly. She didn't wait for him to agree. She stepped into his space, reaching up to grab the heavy canvas lapels of his coat. She pulled him down. Caleb dropped the $40 into the mud. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, hauling her hard against his chest. The kiss was not polite, and it was not delicate. It tasted of black coffee exertion and absolute survival. It was an anchor dropping to the ocean floor, catching hold of solid rock. When he finally pulled back, Resting his forehead against hers, they were both breathing heavily. The cold mountain air rushed around them, but the shivering was gone. "Leave the money in the mud." Josephine murmured, her hand sliding up to grip his broad shoulders. "We have a garden to till before the ground hardens." Caleb let out a low, rough sound that might have been a laugh. He pulled her tight against his chest, burying his face in her hair. The mountain was brutal, the isolation was absolute, but the silence was gone forever. Spring finally cracked the Bitterroot Mountains open, but the real thaw happened inside that small, mud-chinked cabin. Josephine and Caleb proved that survival isn't just about fighting the cold. It's about finding the one person who makes the bitter wind bearable. If their journey from a cold business arrangement to an unbreakable bond kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply grounded emotional Western stories. And share this video with your fellow storytelling fans. Leave a comment below with your favorite moment from their brutal winter.